Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught. I'm the host and the content director here at Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. Joining us, as he does almost every single episode, is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to talk with you.
Hey, Brandon. Good to talk to you. Good to see you.
Now, you're back stateside. You just spent several days over in Rome and in England. Why were you there? How did it go?
Yeah, it was fantastic. I was in Rome for the canonization mass for John Henry Newman, who's been a hero of mine for a long time. I've been looking forward to the day when Newman would be canonized. So I was able to go to that. And as a bishop, I got up there in the front near the altar. And it was just a thrill. Beautiful day in Rome. Liturgy was wonderful. Right afterwards, there was a reception at the Urbanianum, which is a college really right next to the Vatican, right next to the North American College. And all kinds of people were there, including the Prince of Wales. So Prince Charles was there. And he was making his way around the room. So I talked to him for about a minute, and I told him the truth. I said I was very, pleased as a Catholic that he was present there. It meant a lot to us. And the piece he wrote for the Osservatore Romano about Newman. So I just thanked him for that. Then I told him that I was going up to England the next day to give this paper on John Henry Newman. And he listened to me and he said, "Well done." So I got a kick out of that.
I saw some jokes floating around online about Bishop meets King, checkmate, and a lot of chess-related jokes there.
No, I didn't see that. I didn't see that.
Well, when you went to England after that and you delivered this paper at University Church, which is where Newman previously served as vicar before his conversion to Catholicism, I'm sure that was an amazing experience. You also got to visit the graves of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Tell us about some of that.
Wonderful, wonderful. We went to Blenheim Palace the very first day we're in England, where Churchill was born and where Churchill is buried. So that was fun. But then I thought of you a lot, Brandon, when I went to the tombs of Lewis and Tolkien, both of which are very beautiful, very simple in these very English sort of cemeteries. And I found it very moving. I've always kind of liked cemeteries and the graves of famous people. I've always had a thing about visiting those. So I really got a kick out of it. The talk at the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, which, as you say, is sort of the university parish church of Oxford. Newman, of course, preached there. Our hero, C.S. Lewis, gave the Weight of Glory, arguably the most famous sermon of the 20th century, was delivered from that pulpit. The trial of Cranmer back in the kind of the awful years of, the Protestant Catholic wars, that was held there. It really moved me. The vicar told me that at least in, like the ancestor church of that one, Duns Scotus himself would have lectured. So Duns Scotus in the Middle Ages was a student and then a professor at Oxford. And I was very moved by that, Scotus, the tower of that church goes back to 1280, which is just about the time when Scotus was there. And he said in what's, I think, now the basement of that church, that would have been a lecture hall in the Middle Ages. And Scotus himself was there. So it was standing in a place of enormous historical resonance.
Well, today we are going to be unpacking a recent interview between two very popular people in the culture. One of them is Joe Rogan, and the other one is Richard Dawkins. Joe Rogan is a stand-up comedian. He was a mixed martial artist, color commentator. He's probably best known as the super popular host of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. I just checked yesterday. It's the number 4 ranked podcast in the world. Sometimes it floats even into the top 3. Joe's a really fascinating guy. He was raised Catholic and went even to Catholic school for a little bit of time, but had some bad experiences, got pretty jaded, and now he's somewhat angry ex-Catholic, if you want. He regularly interviews top influencers, top authors, musicians, entertainers, all that. And in his most recent episode, he brought on Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins is probably well known to most listeners of this podcast. We've talked about him several times before. He cut his teeth as an evolutionary biologist and was one of the most famous scientific writers of the last, say, 20, 30 years. He is an emeritus fellow of New College in Oxford, where Bishop Barron just visited. And he was the University of Oxford's professor for public understanding of science for more than a decade. But in the popular culture, he's probably best known for authoring a book called The God Delusion, probably the best-selling atheist book of our day. He's one of the leaders of the so-called New Atheism movement. And he just released a book titled Outgrowing God, a beginner's guide, and he describes it as sort of the God Delusion for young people. So it's aimed at teenagers, college age students, and whatnot. So Dawkins released this new book. Rogan invited him onto his podcast to talk about the book. They had about an hour-long discussion. It was just posted a couple days ago at the time that we're recording this. It already has over 1.1 million views, and it's only going up. So this was a really popular, intriguing discussion between two men about God, atheism, religion. So what Bishop Barron and I decided to do is we're gonna talk through several different segments from the interview over 2 episodes. So this episode will cover the first half. Next episode next week we'll cover the second half, and I think what we'll do is just play little 30-second, 60-second segments and then go from there. So, Bishop, sound good?
Good. Let's do it.
All right, let's dive in. Here's the first clip.
Well, it almost seems like if you were studying human beings, if you were something that was completely alien to our civilization, our culture, and you were looking at this strange tendency to believe in something that there's no proof of, and devote a massive amount of energy into defending that, put it into your songs and put it into, your Pledge of Allegiance and all these, which of course was not until the 1950s, but all the different things that people have done in so many different cultures in regards to religion. It almost seems like a natural aspect of being a human being.
You're right that they put an enormous amount of energy and effort and expense and time and cost in share. I mean, some of the extreme sects which whip themselves with horrible weapons, actually bleed,
Yes.
Scar their own backs. It's very, very surprising to a biologist. We would think that they would be more interested in surviving and reproducing, but no, there's something about religion that makes them go to extremes of costliness, and I don't get it, I must say.
So, initial take on that sort of opening statement. This is just from the first few minutes of the interview.
Yeah, here's the first take, Brandon. Go back to the psychologist Carl Jung, who had a kind of interesting relationship with religion. But he said there's been a consensus gentium that God exists. And what he meant was a consensus of the peoples over the ages. We are the very, very peculiar group, we moderns and postmoderns, that now in increasing numbers don't believe in God. The absolute consensus of the peoples of the world is that the sacred or the divine or the transcendent or God exists. Now, that in itself doesn't prove that God is real, but I do think it should give people pause. The view that, it's just a silly, irrational delusion caused by ignorance and just on the face of it, that should strike people as a pretty inadequate explanation. And now it's related to the next point he made, which was this thing for which there is no evidence. Is it likely that across all of human history, as far as we know, the earliest records we have, people are religious, almost 99%. It's again, we are the very peculiar culture. What are the odds that all of those people were simply suffering from a mental illness or a delusion? That there was nothing like, and I'm going to bracket the word, proof or evidence, because it's a very loaded word, the way the new atheists tend to use it. That there was nothing like a rational warrant for belief in God. I think given the consensus gentium, that just seems to be a very unlikely position to hold. There are indeed plenty of rational warrants for belief in God. Now, I'd say most people probably hold them more implicitly. Some philosophers make them very explicit. But you and I know, Brandon, there's probably 20 or more of famous arguments for God's existence. Can we quarrel with all of them, most of them? Yeah, maybe. But show me one area of philosophy that delivers absolutely convincing arguments for the position. That's just the nature of philosophical reasoning. But can you simply say in this dismissive way, there's no justification, there's no proof whatsoever? I think both the consensus gentium argues strongly against that and the presence of many of these arguments that have been entertained by some of the smartest people in the Western world. So just on the face of it, I'm very uneasy with the first premise, really, of this argument.
All right, let's move on to the next clip. This is where Rogan and Dawkins are talking about religion as a response to our human finitude and our sense of our desire for meaning and that kind of stuff. Here's the second clip.
I've thought about this so many times. Do you think that it is in some way a counter to the sort of existential angst that comes from being a finite life form, from being a thinking, conscious, finite life form that's aware of its own demise, it's aware it's coming. So it has to formulate some purpose and some meaning.
And a hope of an afterlife as well.
Yes, and that is the purpose and meaning, right?
Yes, I suppose that's right. Yes, I think that's right. I can understand why people might want to believe a priest who comes along and tells them you don't have to worry about death because you're going to survive it. I'm less understanding of people who make up stories to comfort either themselves or other people. I mean, a made-up story should not be comforting. I don't understand how a made-up story can be comforting. Of course, if you make it up and persuade somebody else, then they could find it comforting. On the other hand, is an afterlife really all that comforting? When you think about half of them believe they're going to go to hell, so it's anything but comforting.
You know, Bishop, when I hear these attempts to explain the psychological genesis of religion, it always bugs me because it ignores the fundamental question of whether it's true, not where did it come from, not why do we believe it, but
the genetic fallacy, so-called.
Exactly.
Yeah, that if we can uncover the psychological roots of a belief, we've determined something about its truth or falsity. That's the genetic fallacy. And of course, we haven't. Even if it's true that it came simply from, our existential angst, it wouldn't prove anything about whether it's true or false. But let me make another point here, Brandon. Go back to the theology of someone like Paul Tillich in the 20th century. Tillich said, finitude in awareness is anxiety. It's one of his formulas. Well, that's what Rogan's beginning with, which is, I think, right. It's true. We're finite and we know it. And what that gives rise to is anxiety because we realize how vulnerable, how limited, how contingent we are. We're not in control of our lives. Now, you can say, therefore I invent this wild fantasy world of religion. That's Feuerbach, that's Marx, that's Freud, that's Sartre and company. That's a standard atheist reading. Or you can do what Paul Tillich did, standing very much in the tradition of St. Augustine, which is to say, to know a limit as a limit is already to be beyond the limit. See what I'm saying? To recognize oneself as finite and to feel the power of that is already, in a sense, to be in the presence of what transcends your finitude. Your anxiety brings you, yes, to the edge of your own experience, what you can know and control. But from that edge, I look, now, of course, it's going to be an inchoate vision. It has to be. I will look, though, into what transcends my finitude. So you could take the atheist route, and there's different ways we could engage that. But I think a very lively option is to begin the way Tillich does and the way Joe Rogan does. That, yes, our anxiety does bring us to the limits of what we can know and control. And that compels us to look into what transcends that limit. So I have no trouble beginning with anxiety if you want. It's a more Protestant way to do it. Catholics tend to begin in a way more optimistically with what kind of links me to God positively. But fine, I'll begin with anxiety. But I don't think it necessarily conduces along the atheist path.
All right, let's move on to the next clip. And I should probably preface
what?
this.
No, Brandon, can I just say one quick thing?
Sure.
About heaven, or is it the next one where he talks about how boring heaven would be?
Yeah, I think I can't remember if we're going to get there or not. But go ahead.
Here's why, because he's talking about the afterlife would not be comforting because first of all the fear of hell, but then I think at some point in the interview he said, well, how boring it would be, to live in heaven for trillions upon trillions of years. Well, of course, that's precisely the wrong way to think about it. Heaven is not endless time. Right? Heaven or the eternal is to be outside of time, to be beyond time. I agree with him to say I'm going to be within time for 80 trillion years. That would be a crushing sort of vampiric type existence. But that's not what eternity means. Eternity means to be outside of time. And the best window to it in our experience would be those best moments in life when we are so engaged in whatever it is, the search for the true or the beautiful or the good or the pleasurable, that we're so into it, we're so ecstatic, we're so out of ourselves that we lose all sense of time, right? That I was just so into that. 2 hours went by, I didn't even know it. That gives you a glimpse of what real eternity is like. It's not the crushing, vampiric, endless time that Dawkins is talking about.
Okay, in this next segment, Rogan and Dawkins have an exchange about psychedelics and their relation to religious experiences. And this is what I thought it would be worth prefacing, that Rogan is a big advocate of using psychedelic drugs to facilitate some sort of transcendent experience. So listen to this clip.
Well, there's so many stories in so many ancient religions that seem to originate with the consumption of some sort of a psychedelic.
Yes.
And, there's many, including John Marco Allegro's The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.
Jesus was a mushroom.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's some, you could see the connection if you were a primitive person with no access to science and you found some mushroom growing under a tree and consumed it and had this unbelievable experience. You would assume that you've transcended this life and gone into this other realm where God exists.
I've actually heard Bishop Joe Rogan interpret before the story of Moses and the burning bush, that some scholars say that this particular bush or this particular tree, when burned, gave off psychedelic, effects. And so Moses was actually hallucinating all these experiences of God because he got too close to this bush that was on fire. What do you make of these psychedelic explanations of religion?
Well, I wouldn't make too much of them. I would say this. Can we find in the history of religion something like this? Sure. Just as there are various techniques, if you look at a lot of different religions, including things like fasting, things like celibacy, things like collective singing, things like liturgical forms that are meant to produce something like an ecstatic experience, right? So are there some religions that have used the psychedelic and all that to trigger a sense of the transcendent? Yeah, sure. But I would never want to reduce what religion is talking about to what's produced by these various methods. To call them perhaps ways of opening a window, ways of opening a door onto a deeper experience of life. I'd be much happier with someone practicing the great contemplative tradition within Catholicism, which is very rich and is accompanied by a very deep psychological perception. Or, if you want to go to the Eastern religions, the way Buddhist monks will use their chant and their prayer techniques to trigger a sense of the mysterious or the opening of the door. But see, what's much more interesting, at least from a biblical perspective, is that God speaks to us. So the various techniques that we might use to kind of bring us to the point, to open the window, those are much less interesting to me than God speaking to us, God, as it were, coming through or around those doors or around those windows and addressing us. That's much more interesting to me. So I just wouldn't put a lot of weight on the psychedelic thing. Sure, it's there in the history of religion, not so much in ours. You don't really find it. You read the Desert Fathers or the Great Contemplatives or Benedict or John of the Cross. You don't find anything like that. You do find very sophisticated methods of contemplation. And where disciplines like fasting and celibacy and group singing and all that play a role. But I wouldn't put that much weight on those things.
I remember during your big Reddit AMA, there were several questions about psychedelics and their relations to the saints and the mystics, and how should we read the mystics? Were they using psychedelics? And I think you echoed a lot of this stuff that you just said here. But what it sort of affirmed for me was that there's a lot of people, especially young people, that are just so burnt out on flattened out secularism that they're searching for something that lifts them to a different realm. Is that your sense?
Sure. Yes, and go from like Aldous Huxley, that the young Thomas Merton read, and then come right up into the 60s, and when the psychedelics were being used, in a more popular way for the first time. There's a spiritual longing behind it. But I would never reduce the experience of God to whatever is happening in my psyche at the, caused by these psychedelic drugs. That's something, and it might be the opening of a window, but I would never reduce authentic religion to whatever is happening there.
Okay, so next up, Joe Rogan and Richard Dawkins turn their attention to the Gospels and the Bible and how they were recorded and transmitted to us today. So here's that clip.
Where the Gospels weren't written down until decades after Jesus' death, if he ever lived, which he probably did. And so, having seen how easily the cargo cults arose, people who worship John Frum, worship Prince Philip, believed that cargo planes were sent by their ancestors and would build dummy airfields with dummy control towers and radar dishes and dummy planes on the airfield and things. This is all within living memory. And something like that, it's just so transparent that something like that went on in the early church.
So what do you make of that historical analysis?
Not at all. I mean, frankly, it just betrays someone who doesn't read deeply in the serious religious tradition. To access what serious religious people, philosophically, mystically, and so on, have thought about religion. So, I mean, that's a very superficial analysis, seems to me. But let me make a point about the Gospels and that famous sort of tossed off line of, they're written many decades later. I first came across that line probably when I was about 20 and reading religion and theology for the first time. It impressed me a lot more when I was 20, when 40 years seems like a long time, Heck, now, as I move through life, that doesn't seem long to me at all. 40 years ago, let's say between the death and resurrection of Jesus and the writing of the first gospel, let's say for the sake of argument, you're talking about 40 years. Let's just say that. I remember things 40 years ago with absolute vividness. If you asked me to contribute to a book, let's say about what was life like at Catholic University in Washington 40 years ago, and someone sat down to interview me, I mean, I have absolutely vivid memories of things that happened at Catholic U 40 years ago. I could tell you teachers I had, what the campus was like, where I lived, great personalities I ran across. Or like when I was there at Catholic U 40 years ago, I went to the first Reagan inauguration. And with a friend of mine, we were 20 years old, and we thought, well, let's see how close we can get. And so we took the metro, and it's before security was really, intense. And we actually got quite close to the dais, to the Capitol. And Reagan was the first one to be inaugurated on the western side of the Capitol, looking toward the mall. I remember Jimmy Carter coming out after a long night of dealing with the hostage crisis. I remember Nancy Reagan wearing a brilliant red dress. I remember Reagan's address. I remember it was a beautiful spring-like day, even though it was January 20th. It was in the 60s. Now, what's my point? My point is, here I am reminiscing about things that happened 40 years ago, and I'm able to do it with ease and with precision. Somehow this little tossed off line of, Jesus lived and died, and then 40 years went by, and then some people just made up these wild stories. That assumes that everyone that knew Jesus went on a spaceship to Mars and just disappeared. There are all these people that Jesus spoke to, who listened to him, who were touched by him, maybe cured by him. The apostles themselves who saw him after he rose from the dead, they didn't disappear. Rather, they were very thick on the ground. Doing what? Preaching, teaching, privately, publicly, telling the stories. And then all these people that also knew and saw and heard Jesus, taking it in, repeating, telling their own versions of stories. It's all of that dense, loamy, textured preparation that leads to the Gospels. So now let's say Mark, first Gospel. Traditionally, Mark is seen as a young apprentice, associate of St. Peter. We know that Mark, from the quality of his Greek, which is lively but sort of primitive, probably had Greek as a second or even third language. He was probably a Jewish companion of Peter who learned Greek, but listened to Peter and to his preaching. Peter, who knew Jesus intimately, directly. Mark taking in his preaching. And having listened to now all these years of an oral tradition, finally, yes, putting pen to papyrus and writing it down. Now, same with Luke, same with the Gospel of John. Whoever put penned a papyrus was someone in the community around John, the beloved disciple, who knew Jesus, vividly remembered him. To say, oh, it was 40 years later, so what? I remember lots of things from 40 years ago. If someone told me, oh, Robert Sokolowski never taught at Catholic U in the 1980s. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. I remember. I was in his class, So this view that somehow the Gospels are just kind of tissues of lies and fabrications is just ridiculous. And the older I get, the more ridiculous that suggestion seems to me.
I think it's worth observing that the scholarly consensus places the Gospel of Mark, probably the earliest gospel, around 66 to 70 AD, although some scholars have dated it even earlier into the 50s. However, all of the writings of St. Paul predate the writings of the Gospels, and Paul pretty strongly affirms many of the main facts about Jesus, his life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, most importantly. And Paul's writings can be traced to not only within a decade, but within single-digit years of Jesus's resurrection. The traditions he used date back that closely. Yeah. So now we're not talking 40 years, we're talking about a small handful of years.
Sure. And I've always felt this objection is much more from faculty lounges in the late 20th century and 21st century than it is, from a realistic assessment of the situation.
All right, let's move on to the next clip. So this is Joe Rogan and Richard Dawkins talking about how religion provides a scaffolding and a sense of moral structure for people, but why that should not necessarily make people believe in religion. Here's the clip.
Find great comfort in these belief systems. It gives them sort of, I've often said that it gives them some sort of like a scaffolding for their structure of the world, their ethics, their morals. They can use religion as some sort of a mechanism to help them get by, something that they can climb on to ease some of the confusion of the unknown.
I'm sure that's true, but I don't understand why anybody therefore thinks that therefore the religion is true. Why would you think that because it provides you with a scaffold you can climb on, that makes it true?
What do you think of that, Bishop?
Well, we're right back in a way at the genetic fallacy. So in a way, sure, it doesn't in itself prove that it's true. So in a way that's going to go nowhere on either side. But I would add this though, Brandon, the whole scaffolding thing. Do we need God to be morally upright? Well, I would say no, in the measure that you've got atheists and so on who can be very morally upright people. I'm not denying that for a minute. They can be good moral people. But it seems to me what you can't do is justify ultimately the objectivity of your moral values apart from God. It becomes a very dicey business when you take God out of the equation, and now you try. Give me a theory, because I've heard all of them. Give me a theory that justifies a moral system of objective moral values. Very quickly, outside of this ultimate metaphysical ground, these claims become relativized and they become culturally determined. And then we move into very dangerous territory, it seems to me, when we say, well, then why not shift, with the times? And so you got your point of view, I got mine. Sure, I think this is the right thing to do, but who am I to judge you? Take God out of the equation and try it. It's not that easy. Now, to justify truly objective moral norms. Now, if you think, what's the problem with that? Well, then, Adolf Hitler had his own, culturally grounded reasons for doing what he did. Joseph Stalin, following Lenin, said you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And so why not kill 50 million people? I'm using extreme cases to make the point that once you take out an objective metaphysical grounding for moral value, you got a hard time avoiding a sheer relativism and subjectivism. So I pursue it that way. I wouldn't say, ipso facto, an atheist has to be a bad person or an atheist can't be morally upright. But I would say an atheist has a very hard time justifying or explaining the objectivity of his moral claims.
It reminds me of a line of argument that the young G.K. Chesterton used when he was just an atheist. He explains this in his book, Orthodoxy. He said, I was a young atheist and I was reading all these atheists making arguments against God. But then I realized I'm coming to believe in God for all those same reasons. And this was
Yeah.
one of them. They said, it provides this scaffolding or this structure for people who need it. And he said, well, I do need it. And I count
do
that
need
as
it, yeah.
evidence for God. Like,
Yeah.
as you just explained, it provides the scaffolding for objective moral truths.
Right. And what you did there, Brandon, is very interesting because you carefully move from a purely psychological, and that's what you hear in Rogan and Dawkins. There was, kind of a patronizing, like, well, poor things, they need this little psychological support. So there's that way, and that's more genetic fallacy kind of stuff. Like, well, all right, who cares if it comes from some psychological need? But what you did is you moved it into the metaphysical realm, that I need a scaffolding, if you want, to explain the objectivity of moral values, just as I would say, to explain the objectivity of the intelligibility of the universe. Now, that's getting us back to the scientific realm. Can you be an atheist scientist? Yeah, of course you can. Look, Dawkins. But can you ultimately ground your sense of the intelligibility of the world apart from God? I think there you've got a much harder row to hoe.
Okay, we'll move on to the next clip, and this one contains a classic Richard Dawkins argument. He features it in his God Delusion book. It's an argument that Joe Rogan describes as, quote, a home run argument, presumably against God. So here it is.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about your book was when you explained to people that everyone who practices a religion is an atheist. You're just an atheist in regards to Zeus or Apollo.
Or the 999 other gods.
Yes.
Right,
and
yes.
that's a home run with this argument.
Yes.
Because
some of us just go one god further.
Yes. Yeah. But that really is a home run, because this concept of, me and my friends jokingly would always say praise Odin when anything would happen that was pretty good or cool.
Yes.
We say praise Odin, and I started doing it online, and people really got into saying praise Odin about certain things.
I rather like that, yes.
Some people got mad at me. They actually got mad that you're mocking Christianity by saying praise Odin.
Of course you are. Why not?
I wasn't even really. Yeah. I was just having fun.
Yes.
I was having fun because Odin seemed like a cool god. It's an old school god. It's the god of the Vikings.
All right. Well, Bishop, I love Vikings, but bracketing the Odin question here, what do you make of this? It's a very famous argument that Dawkins helped popularize, often described as the one God further objection. He's trying to make it sound like, hey, look, we're all atheists. It's just that I'm an atheist in regard to one more God than you. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, a home run. To me, it's just a total swing and a miss, that argument. I'll get at it two ways, one negative, one positive. The negative one is this. Whether you talk about Odin or Thor or Osiris or Zeus or Poseidon, any of these mythological figures would be beings in the world, right? So however you're imagining them, they're kind of super versions of finite things in the world. They're superhuman type figures. What serious people mean by God has nothing to do with any figure like that. God is the unconditioned source of existence itself. God is the sheer act of to be itself. God is not one being among many. God is the sheer act of being as such, which means that holding any of these finite sort of figures, these mythological characters, to be God is just sort of silly once you understand what serious people mean by the word God. So not believing in them has nothing to do with not believing in the true God. The true God has so little to do with figures such as that. So it's apples and oranges. It's not like, oh, now just one more example of debunking Osiris or Thor or Zeus. Those figures have nothing to do with what serious people mean by the word God. But here's the more positive way to do it, Brandon. It's simply not the case that, let's say, a Christian would hold, well, we're right and they're all wrong. So everybody else that's ever believed in any sort of God is wrong. No, on the contrary. Vatican II teaches, for example, that there are elements of truth in every great religion. There are rays of light. There are indications of truth in every major religion. We're not simply saying, we got it, everybody else has been crazy. No, they even the mythological religions represent some kind of aspiration toward the transcendent, some sense of the transcendent. There's something right in all the religions of the world. So it's not this stark either or that they want to propose. And the argument kind of hinges upon the either or quality of it. I wouldn't do an either or. in this positive way. I'd say it's a kind of both and, that we'd recognize the fullness of divine revelation contained in Christianity, but elements of the truth of it contained in all these great religions. So you could do it negatively, that these figures have nothing to do with the true God. Positively, there's something right in all the great religions. So it's not this stark either or that they want to propose. Here's another line from, I mentioned Tillich earlier. Tillich, responding to Feuerbach, said, yeah, people project all the time. So I'd call them idolatrous forms of religion, involve projections of gods. Tillich said, but the one thing you can't project is the screen. So there's a screen upon which these projections are happening. What's that? I would call that the fundamental religious sensibility. Now I'll go right back to my first answer, the consensus gentium. Why has there been this consensus across the ages and cultures that God exists? That's the screen, if you want. That's that deep, call it spiritual intuition that undergirds and runs through all the great religions of the world. That's what you have a much harder time explaining away. You can quarrel with the various projections if you want, but you can't really project the screen. You can't quarrel with the screen. The screen is what's really interesting, I'd say, in all the great religions of the world.
Whenever I hear this one God further objection from many of my atheist friends, I often respond with a political analogy. I would say, suppose an anarchist comes to you, anarchist, someone who rejects all form of government, and says, look, everybody is basically an anarchist. You just embrace democracy, but you reject all other forms of government. So you're basically like me, an anarchist. I think most of us would see how silly that is, that just because you reject other alternatives doesn't mean you're the same as the one who rejects all of the alternatives. Okay.
No, it's a swing and a miss, that argument.
And as a follow-up, I should add, on our website, strangenotions.com, we have an article from Dr. Edward Fazer. I'll link to it here in the show notes, called Debunking the One God Further Objection. And he takes it apart pretty meticulously. Okay, let's wrap up here with one final clip from the first half. Again, we'll pick apart the second half next week. In this half, Joe gets a little personal and explains his experiences being raised Catholic, and then what sort of rubbed him the wrong way about Catholicism. So here it is.
Okay.
When I was a boy, I was raised Catholic, and I had an aunt who was Jewish, and my uncle married my aunt, and he had to convert to Judaism. And it was like a big deal in the family. Everybody would talk about it. And there was no anger. Everybody loved my aunt. She's a great lady. But it was just strange that he was converting to this other religion. I remember I was 5 years old when this was going on, and I was like, wait. What do you mean another religion?
Yes, quite.
I was like, what's going on?
Yes. Yeah.
And they were like, oh, she's Jewish. I go, what does that mean? What do you mean she's Jewish?
Yes.
And they had to explain it to me.
Yes.
And I go, okay, but she believes in God. Like, yeah, that they believe in God. Okay, so why is it a different thing? Well, they believe Jesus was a different kind of a thing. It was they don't necessarily believe he was the guy that we think he was.
But if it had been Hindu, they'd have had to explain to you they believe in hundreds of gods.
Right, Vishnu and yes. Yeah, and then we'd have to go way back. Yeah, it's just. When you first hear that, I mean, that was probably put the first seeds of doubt in my head when I was a young boy. When I was like, wait, well, there's more than one? Like, I'll never forget that moment, because we were all sitting around the dinner table, and I was just a little kid. And I remember thinking, what do you mean there's another one?
I think that's a very powerful way of getting to children, is to just simply tell them that.
Yes.
Telling them nothing but facts. You're not indoctrinating them.
Right.
You're just telling them. There are lots of different religions, and Hindus believe in hundreds of gods, and Jews believe in one God, and Muslims believe in one God, and they don't believe in Jesus, and just lay out all the different religions. That would be a very good educational exercise.
What do you make of that, Bishop?
But why? No, that's the striking is, are there different scientific theories within, let's say, quantum mechanics, different ways of approaching it? Yeah, sure there are. Let's argue about them. We don't say, well, therefore, the whole exercise of quantum mechanics is a waste of time because there are different points of view within it. When I was a kid, I grew up in a very democratic family. I'm from Chicago. It would be Irish Catholic. You were, of course, a Democrat. I remember when I first kind of came across people that were Republicans. For my parents, that was like that was an affront that you'd be a Republican. Well, what does that prove? That therefore the whole political enterprise is a waste of time? No, let's have an argument about it. You got a Democratic point of view, a Republican point of view. Now let's argue. I don't see either Democrats or Republicans giving up on the operation because there are a variety of viewpoints. So why should we think that's true with regard to religion? So yeah, there are Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Catholics and Protestants. Fine, fine. People approach this thing in different ways. They have different understandings. Let's have an argument about it. Don't fall into violent warfare, but also don't take this option of, oh, well, therefore the whole thing is just a waste of time. No, let's have an informed, reasonable argument about it. So I don't see at all why a variety of viewpoints within the category of religion would somehow disqualify religious discourse. I mean, that doesn't follow to me at all. I'd say it's an invitation to have a good conversation.
Bishop, over the years, I've talked with a lot of people, mostly online, that have left Christianity and become atheist after reading the God Delusion. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but one pattern I noticed is that a lot of these people were raised in more fundamentalist Protestant homes.
I found that too.
Where they were sort of closeted in, and they weren't exposed to, say, even the existence of atheists, that there were people that didn't believe in God.
Yeah.
And so when they went off to college or when they went off into the working world and they encountered people who rejected God, people of other religions, people making arguments against Christianity, it was such a culture shock that they suddenly, like as Rogan said, it was the seeds of doubt. So I feel like that's the sort of person Rogan and Dawkins are trying to engage or talk about.
Yeah, that's very much true, Brandon. In my experience, too, dealing on the internet, is when I meet these really fierce atheists or agnostics, you scratch the surface a little bit, and you'll find out they're kind of recovering fundamentalists, or they were formed in a very kind of anti-intellectual religious tradition. And what I would say is, no, move into the Catholic space. Thank God, in a way. I mean, I've been a critic of the Catholic education I got as a little kid in the post-conciliar period. But see, I think I took in almost naturally this Catholic faith and reason approach. Catholics are not biblical fundamentalists. And we're very open to a healthy dialogue with all the different forms of reason. We use reason within our theological framework. And I think that does make for a much better evangelical engagement of the secular and the atheist realm. And yeah, I think there's straw men all over these arguments, and they're straw men born of a naive sort of fundamentalist Christianity. So I would say to some of my atheist interlocutors, come up out of that world, come up out of that simplistic construal of religion into a more serious arena.
Well, it's time now for a question from one of our listeners. Every podcast episode, we take one question from you, from our listeners, and you get to ask Bishop Barron whatever's on your mind. If you have a question, visit askbishopbarron.com. That's where you can record your question on any device. Today, we got one from Chris. He lives in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's asking about the future of Word on Fire, your ministry, Bishop Barron. Here's the question.
Okay.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Chris Fagan from Christian Brothers University in Memphis, Tennessee. Go Bucks. And my question is, have you ever considered making Word on Fire a religious order for priests or religious sisters to further cement the evangelical mission of Word on Fire? Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, my uncle was a Christian brother. He died many years ago, but he taught there for a while in Memphis. The short answer is yes, I have thought about it. And it's a somewhat complicated business. There's a lot of elements to that. But yes, I've thought about it as a way of propagating the ministry. We have the Word on Fire Institute already in existence, so calling lay people, though some priests are in it too, but calling largely lay people to become evangelizers themselves. But I have dreamed about that. An order of priests and or sisters who are really dedicated to this work of evangelizing and preaching and responding to the call of our time, which is the call of disaffiliation. A lot of orders sprang up, after the French Revolution in Europe because people sensed that the faith was under assault. It's even truer today, it seems to me. And the call of our time is to respond to that. So, yeah, I have thought about it. So I just say stay tuned.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode. Just a couple of final items here. One is that our own Matt Nelson, he's the assistant director at the Word on Fire Institute. He just finished filming a new course for the Institute that's tentatively titled Evangelizing Open-Minded Non-Believers. And he specifically engages Joe Rogan throughout the course, using him as sort of the paradigm or the archetypal non-believer you'll encounter in the culture, who's a little resistant, maybe is parroting a lot of the new atheist slogans. How do you reach somebody like that? So Matt Nelson just finished recording that course. It'll be released soon in the future. So join the Word on Fire Institute if you want to dig even deeper into that. Second, Advent. Advent is right around the corner. And we have some Advent booklets that we'd like to send you. Just go to wordonfireshow.com/Advent. You'll get a really beautiful booklet that has the gospel reading for every day throughout Advent, along with Bishop Barron's reflection on it. So get yours at wordonfireshow.com/Advent. Thanks for joining us. And next week, we'll have the second half of this discussion between Joe Rogan and Richard Dawkins. Thanks for listening.